Hello, Paul.
Hello, Marcelo.
Hi, how are you? Welcome to the Peak Performance Radio podcast.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Today I'll be speaking to, and I'm very proud to have him on this call, is Dr. Paul Juris. He's the Executive Director of the Cybes Research Institute. I've also worked with Paul in the past at the Equinox Fitness Training Institute as the Director of Education there as well. Paul has an extensive background as a applied exercise scientist. His forte is, I think, he's the epitome of the critical thinker. The best thing that I could hope and encourage everyone on that's going to be hearing this on iTunes is to pay attention to his mindset. He really taught me a couple of key things. One thing is the most important question: so what? I think everyone that has met Paul remembers that quite clearly. Welcome, Paul. Is there anything else that, as far as I could mention that you were a strength and conditioning coach for the Dallas Mavericks, but I know that you have an extensive background, so it's kind of hard to cover on a traditional intro.
Well, thanks, Marcelo. Just calling me a critical thinker is the best compliment that you could ever give me. And, my experience is sort of varied, and, we don't need to get into all the details, but it certainly helped to shape the way I think. So, but thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Great. So I'm going to dive right into some of the questions. Some are standard questions that I want to ask across a broad community and get their perspective on the responses to these questions, and then I've prepared some other questions that are more industry specific.
Okay.
So the first question is, when you hear the term peak performance, what does that mean to you?
Well, performance to me suggests that someone is working towards achieving some goal, whatever that may be. And it could be an individual goal, it could be sports related, it can be just daily life related, like getting out of a chair, it could be individual or team activity. But the notion of anything we do being goal oriented, and then performance would be a measure of how effectively one accomplishes a goal. So peak performance really is looking at the frequency, the consistency, and in many cases, in my mind, the efficiency by which one is accomplishing goals or acquiring goals.
Great. There's really, the things that I've been seeing in that response to that answer is everyone has a similar response, but it's quite interesting seeing that from everyone's different experiences and different walks in life, you could really boil it down to the common responses. It's usually athletically driven. There's a goal in mind, and there's a process to that. That being said, what were some influences in your life that led you to your path as far as people? Who made the greatest impact in getting you to where you are today?
Well, early on for me, the first person was Susan Higgins, and she was my very first professor when I started my education career in human movement studies. The very first class I had was Introduction to Human Movement Studies, and she was engaging me in some thinking and some topics that I had never heard before that I thought were just absolutely phenomenal. And she really helped guide me down the path. And then later on, when I was sort of struggling to figure out the direction that I wanted to go, and this is after I finished my master's degree, I called her again and asked her for some advice, and she offered me some great advice, which was to pursue my education, because after my master's degree, I thought that I was done. And she very convincingly explained to me that I wasn't, and I had a whole other direction and goal that I needed to pursue, and she was right there. The next influence was her husband, who became my doctoral advisor and my mentor, Joe Higgins. He's the one who taught me how to think. And what I really appreciated about the experience with him is that he didn't tell me what to think. He taught me how to think and how to think critically. And that was a challenge for me. And the whole program that I went through at Teachers College was challenging because it really forced me to become a critical thinker. And as you mentioned in your introduction, it was the whole so what question. And sometimes we have ideas and we never really dive deeply enough into any of them in order to extract any useful information or any value from them. So he was the one who really helped me to become a real critical thinker and not to accept something just because it's there or lots of people are saying it, but to actually investigate and think about it and ask the so what and answer the so what question. So that was really helpful. And then, interestingly enough, there was a time in my life where I was really turning around and not knowing which direction to go in. And a friend of mine, Peter Hirsch, who owned a boys' camp in Maine, had asked me if I would go up and teach baseball at his camp. And it was something that I did sort of whimsically, but as it turned out, it helped to set me on a path because I thought that if I could teach kids how to play ball, I could be a PE teacher. And it was that revelation that actually got me to Hunter College in New York, where I started studying with Susan. So in a way, I owe it all to Peter, which is kind of interesting in and of itself.
That's really, really neat. And plus, you just said my alma mater, so I love Hunter College.
Yeah, listen, I had a great experience there. I mean, the Human Movement Studies program there was absolutely outstanding. And as you know, I was also an assistant professor there for 7 years. So that also helped to develop my teaching skills and foster and nurture my teaching ability. And I always look fondly at, on that program, even though it doesn't exist there any longer.
Yeah, sadly, unfortunately. Same with the PE program.
Yeah.
If there was a couple of books that you would say influenced your life, what would be some of those books that have influenced your life as personally and also professionally?
That's an interesting question. I would say the first one is a textbook, and it happens to be the book that Susan used in her Human Movement Studies class. I still have it on my bookshelf after many, many, many years. We're talking about 40-some-odd years. But it's by Brower and Zernike, and it's called The Efficiency of Human Movement. And it really exposed me to a way of thinking about human movement and the way we organize movement that was really fascinating to me and opened my eyes to an area of science that I had never seen before. And I really enjoyed it, and I still use it. I use it in developing lesson plans. It's got some wonderful information in it, and it was the very first resource that I had that showed me that there's this whole world of science out there, which was just absolutely brilliant. And then the second one was a novel, and it's Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead. And I don't know if you've read it, but The Fountainhead is all about the spirit of individuality, of finding something that you think is critical and sticking to it because it's what you think, not necessarily what the rest of the world thinks. And the idea that prevailing wisdom guides us in many ways has always been troubling to me. I think people should think for themselves and to be able to go against the flow if there's a reason to. And as you know me, Marcelo, if the world is going right for no other reason other than the world is doing it, I'm going to go left because I can't think that things are true just because everyone thinks them to be true. There was a time in our history when most of the people on our planet thought that the Earth revolved, that the sun revolved around the Earth, and most of those people on the planet were wrong. So that, The Fountainhead was one of those books that it took it to an extreme, but it made you realize that, people, if they have a true vision, they need to stick to that vision, and they have to be willing to challenge what everybody else is saying because it may not necessarily be true.
Actually, I did read. I'm in the process of reading Fountainhead, so it's funny that you bring that book up. It's. I've read Ayn Rand before, and she's a solid. It's a big read. It's a great read. It's just you need a lot of time to really do it justice, in my opinion.
Well, there's no question, and it's funny. You asked me who influenced me, and of course, she influenced me through her writing, but her character, Howard Rourke, is the real hero. And again, I think that someone who's willing to take a stand for something, but is willing to do it in not just because you can do it. Anybody can do that, but you have to back it up. Anyone can come out and make a statement and say this works or this doesn't work, and be very different from everyone else. That's okay, but you still have to back it up. There still has to be evidence. You still have to support it. And that's the difference, I think, between critical thinking and just doing things because it seems like the thing to do. There are a lot of things I agree with. There are a lot of things I disagree with. And either way, on either side of that, I'm going to try to support my arguments with as much evidence as I can find. And doing that, I think, is critical to everyone's success.
That really leads me into some questions that I've been prepping that I think, recently last week there was Cybes shared a blog post about CrossFit. Mm-hmm. And when I read it and it was kind of your ideas, for me, I loved it because this what you just echoed is exactly what I have arguments with. What do you think of CrossFit?
Well, I've been asked that many times and by a lot of different people, and I only have an opinion about it. It's not that I can document a lot. I know that there are people that are absolute advocates, and for a population, I think it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, there are people that love it. They enjoy the process, the workout of the day, the types of activities. I mean, these are real devotees, and I think that you'll find those folks in CrossFit Nation who support it 100%. I think that there's a large population for whom it's completely inappropriate. I think, the idea of training, first of all, the idea of training at high intensity it's been very faddish for a while, and one of the things that we're beginning to question is whether it's absolutely necessary. For many people, it's just too intense. And, for a lot of people who'd like to train like elite athletes, I mean, frankly, there's a reason why we refer to them as elite athletes. There aren't too many people in the world who can do with their bodies what elite athletes do. So the idea that anybody can train at that level, I think, is misplaced faith in something that may actually be harmful. So, is it good? Yes. Anything can be good. Any exercise is good. Any exercise is bad. It's not so much what it is, but how it's applied and to whom it's applied. And so, I think that, as I said, CrossFit has its place. I think for some individuals it's great. I think for a lot of individuals it's not great. And that could probably be said about a whole number of different things. I think that's politically correct and maybe skirting the fence, but it's true. So that's kind of what I think of it.
No, I echo the same conversations. A lot of people ask me. There's certain things I have gripes with, not assessing, not really. One size fits all is not exactly the ideal with such a scale of limitations with people when they try to do movement that they're not on that scale of complexity or on that scale of stability. They lack certain things. So to apply a power clean, as an example, with the whole group, I have issues with it. That's why when I read your article, I was very curious to ask you that question because it's interesting since the industry right now has such disruption going on, and we have to be more careful as people that advocate movement, advocate exercise. You always hear questions about selectorized equipment and about free weight training. What's your opinion on selectorized training?
Well, look, let's face it, I work for a company that builds selectorized products, so, anything that I say is going to be perceived as biased. But, here's my overall thinking about the concept in general. It all comes down to what people perceive as functional training, which is, the rally cry today. Everything has to be functional. But from what I'm seeing, the way people address function is as a process. So engaging in functional training is a process of functional training. So what are you doing in your exercises, and how does that reflect what you would normally do in real life or performance, as you've initiated this conversation? To me, function is not a process, it's an outcome. If you're functional, that means you're doing something better. It doesn't mean that you're replicating the activity in your exercise behavior. It means that the activity that you're interested in is improved in some way. That's what function is. It's an outcome. It's not a process. And so for me, and I've experienced this throughout my professional life, I can get improved outcomes using any number of different modalities, whether it's free weights or cables or suspension straps or selectorized equipment. I can use selectorized products to get people very, very strong. I can improve their muscular endurance. We improve their tissue density. All of those things contribute to an improved outcome. And, for those people who say, well, it doesn't help you get better, show me evidence that it doesn't help you get better. Where's the research that says that doing a leg extension actually is inhibitory? That because I did leg extensions, I'm going to fall down in the street because my brain just doesn't know what to do with the strength that I've developed in my quadriceps. It just can't figure it out. It's really astounding to me that people want to take that position, yet at the same time, we need to employ special movement screens because the brain is so adept at compensating for weaknesses. We need a screen to be able to determine where that compensation is coming from, but the brain can't figure out what to do with a muscle that has strength in it. It's a really absurd argument. And so, the idea of what I'm using is really irrelevant. It's a question of how I use it. And I'll give you an example. There's a study that's being finished right now. We've been working with a university in England, Coventry University, and there was a student who was working on a project where he's looking at repeated sprint ability in soccer players. So the repeated sprint ability test is you do like a 40 or 60-yard dash. You need to do it as fast as you can, so you're obviously looking at peak running speed. But the repeated test is you do 10 of them, and you want to see how well the athlete sustains that pace over repeated sprints. So it's not only a power test, but it's a power endurance measure. And he trained his athletes in a power training mode using selectorized equipment. Leg press, leg extension, leg curl, hip abduction, and plantar flexion, calf machine, all selectorized products. And there were two different groups. One was a traditional strength group, and one was a power group. The traditional strength group didn't see any improvements. Now, someone could say, sure, they were selectorized products. Of course you wouldn't see improvements. But the power training group saw significant improvements in peak running speed and the ability to sustain their speed over repeated sprints. So in that case, the selectorized equipment worked fine. It wasn't the equipment that was at issue. It was the way the equipment was being used in order to evoke a power output change or performance measure. So, this whole thing of what works and what doesn't work is just, it's gotten so polarized today. And again, I don't think people step back and really think about what's going on. I think they're just jumping on the bandwagon and saying, hey, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. You do this, you don't do that. This is good, that's bad. We live in this very black and white world. There's a lot of good stuff out there. I try to find that when I can. And, I try to find that when I can. And, we have an interview question here for anybody coming into our program, and that basically goes, tell me what exercise you think is the least functional exercise you can think of. And there's no right answer. I mean, whatever that may be. And then the follow-up question is, now tell me how it can be functional. And so we're trying to see if people can actually look at something from a variety of perspectives in order to find a reason to use something, as opposed to accepting the arguments against using things.
Great question, because it is the process of being able to think for yourself, not having an influence put upon you by mass media or by aspirational messaging. You mentioned movement screening before, and there's been a big push in the industry to apply a functional movement screen, and I've had arguments with people saying that, how can we, because movement, everything is a screen, in my opinion, number one, and how can you base a movement screen without, if you don't know there's a structural problem? That's where I always have arguments with it. What's your thoughts on the functional movement screen?
Well, I'm sure the intent of the screen is legitimate. I think that it was developed so that someone looking at a patient population could try to identify some issues that could be addressed in the process of rehabilitation. With anything like this, I mean, this is kind of a delicate thing, but with anything like this, you have to subject any measure like this to some level of scrutiny. And the problem that I see is that process was not in place from the beginning and from the development of this screen, so that, first of all, there were no norms developed for normal and abnormal populations. And secondly, there were no sensitivity and specificity scores done. And keep in mind that while there are numbers that are applied to the outcomes, this is purely a subjective analysis. This is, do you like what you see or do you not like what you see? And then you apply a number to it. The problem is the numbers go 1 to 3. So, and forget the 0. I mean, because I don't need a movement screen to know that someone is in pain when they're doing something. I don't need something to tell me that. If I ask you to pick up an object and it hurts, you're going to let me know it hurts. So for all intents and purposes, the screen is a 1 to 3 scoring system. And the problem there is that if I tested 2,000 people with this screen, the average score is going to be a 2. Now, if I'm looking for statistical significance in trying to determine whether one score is better than another, an average score of a 2 on any individual value is not going to lead to statistically significant differences. So I can't determine whether I have real meaning in the measures. But what's really fascinating to me is I've researched this heavily, and I've got stacks of articles of other people using the screen. And what I've seen so far is that there's no correlation between scores on the screen and performance measures. So if you were to take the screen and apply it to a bunch of athletes and then do a series of field tests like shuttle runs and T-tests and vertical jumps and things like that, there's no correlation between the scores on the screen and any performance characteristics. So it really doesn't tell me how well somebody's going to perform. The other measure that they discuss is injury prediction or predictive value. And in this case, the information that we see in the research is fairly consistent that anyone who scores a 14 or lower has a greater risk of sustaining some type of injury than someone who scores a 15 or higher. So if some person scores a 14 and another person scores a 15, which is a 1-point difference in the screen, then the person with the 14 stands a greater risk of injury than the person with the 15. But here's the problem. If someone scores a 15, there's nothing in the evidence to suggest that they're going to run a greater risk of injury than someone who scores a 21. So in that regard, I have to really question the validity and credibility of this as an actual measure. I don't know what they're measuring. It's purely subjective. People say, well, it's only a starting point. Well, anything's a starting point. I mean, I can have you do anything and look at that as a starting point. But there's no way to assess the validity of these measures. And then lastly, and this hasn't been published in the mainstream literature, but it was provided for me, there was a study done by a group that was looking at the effects of practice on the FMS scores. And because when the FMS is done, people are not given time to practice these tests. And for a lot of people, some of these measures, when they do it, it would be the first time they ever do it. The hurdle step, for example, I mean, nobody does that in real life. So, this is a new skill. Doing a lunge on a 2x4 with a rod behind your back is a new skill. So this study actually looked at the effect of practice on scores, and they broke them up into 3 different groups. It was 2-week period. One group practiced once a week for 2 weeks, one group every other day for 2 weeks, and one group every day for 2 weeks. So there were either 2, 7, or 14 practice sessions. And the group that practiced every day had a nearly 40% improvement in score. The group that practiced 7 times had a roughly 25% improvement in score. And even the group that only had 2 practices had a 10% improvement in score. Well, if you normally score a 14 and you practice twice, you're going to go up to almost a 16, which takes you out of the injury risk category and puts you in a normal category just because you had some practice. So, I think there are serious concerns about this. I don't think any of those has really been addressed, and until they do, it's not something that I would necessarily support doing.
It is really interesting because, I often wonder, and I've been on both sides of the fence. I've been a trainer, I've been a manager, I've also now been a vendor, and I've seen the influence of what marketing could do in the industry, and I've also seen other things in the consumer world as far as advertisements go. What do you think of the programming out there that advocates for workouts like 6 times a week at high intensities all the time? You've kind of mentioned before that high intensity is not sustainable over a period of time. What's your opinion on all this, like P90X and Insanity and all these different types of, I call them marketing fluff programs, because I just don't get it as a trainer and as an educator. How can we put going back to the cookie cutter approach, how can that really, how is that acceptable? I often wonder, what's your opinion on that?
It depends on how you look at it. I mean, I'm sure that there are people out there that benefit from these programs. I mean, there's no question about it.
Yes.
So, we could listen, Marcelo, we could create anything. You and I could sit here and we could come up with some really cool thing and package it and market it and sell it out there, and lots of people would buy it. And maybe they buy it because of the cool factor, or maybe they buy it because it's novel. And if you look at the way our industry goes, I mean, fitness is fashion, and people do things because they're new and interesting and, different. And, the latest one is Zumba. Is Zumba good? Sure, it's good. I mean, it gets people moving. If anything, that's a great thing because our society is so sedentary, right? So if this provides a fun way to get people up and moving, and they're going to do it, and it's going to help them become more healthy, then I think that's great. But you know what? It'll fade out after a while, too, just like everything that came before it. I think, for me, what we need to do in our society is not promote, ripped six-pack abs and all of the things that these people are doing and getting people down to 6% body fat. That's great for 1% of our population. The bigger problem is that 85% of the people living in our society do not do anything. And we have an obesity and diabetes epidemic that's consuming this country to the extent that 42% of our overall healthcare expenditures are going towards the treatment of illness and diseases related to obesity and diabetes. Doing P90X is not going to help obese people. They're not going to do that. We need to offer sensible solutions to get people active and moving so that they can become more healthy. I think our focus has been on fitness and performance, and I think what we really need to do is take a step back and say, how do we promote health in our society? And some of these things are just too intimidating, they're too challenging, and they're really, frankly, quite disruptive. And I think, we need to step back, because the person who can solve that problem, the person who can get people into the gyms or into some space and get them moving and get them active and improving the quality of their lives, that person's going to hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's going to be the superstar going forward. What we are doing now is we are appealing to a smaller and smaller and smaller subgroup of our population, and it's not necessarily in everyone's best interest.
Yeah, that's so well stated. The problem in our society as far as obesity and the diseases that are attributed towards obesity are significant. Sedentary lifestyles, people always have excuses. And I mean, as a trainer, I used to always hear it, I don't have time. And, that leads me to, from a training standpoint, it's always doing best with the time that you have. If you were presented that option and a person couldn't do, let's say, cardiovascular work, what would be a solution if a person only had twice a week to work out and, maybe at 30 to 45 minutes as an option there?
Well, that's a great question, Marcelo. I think that, the immediate response would be, let's jump into high intensity. But again, most people don't really tolerate high intensity very well, nor do they necessarily want to. But I do think we should be looking back at our classic view of circuit training. I think that if we can combine strength training and cardiovascular training into a circuit-type environment where it's relatively easy to do, it can be done even without supervision, but normally it's even better if there's supervision there. Those are great solutions. There are people who are doing this right now with tremendous success. These are folks that are here domestically and even internationally. They're getting programs up where they're circuit models. They're based on fixed station exercise. They do mix in some kind of calisthenic free body movement to make it fun and interesting. But these are circuits that last anywhere from 30 to 50 minutes. People really enjoy it. It's energizing. There's a group environment and atmosphere, so it's got this friends and family kind of feel to it. There's a little competition. These are the things that are starting to generate a lot of success because you get the metabolism going, you're working on strength, the heart rate's up. It's all good stuff, and I think the folks who come out with these solutions are actually going to make great inroads towards improving the health of our society.
That's a great response. One last question, and then I'm going to ask you first of all, I'd love to have you back on to talk about some programming questions as far as exercise programming goes. I would love to have you back just to talk about a little bit about SHOP, basically.
Okay.
Second, this really, for me, wraps it up. If you had to recommend to a person right now in college or a person that's just starting in the industry and wanted to aspire to be a director of education or wanted to aspire to be a teacher or a person in your roles that you've attained, professor, strength and conditioning coach, educator, what would you recommend for them to do that can give them a head start?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I've done a lot of things. I've done a lot of things, Marcelo, and I've told everyone the same thing. Not by design. The things that I've experienced in my life have either fallen in the right direction, so I got lucky, or some door closed and I had to find another one that was open. And so, I'm proud of my experiences, and I've done a lot of different things, but as I said, I didn't plan it that way. So, there are two things that I tell people that I think are absolutely necessary. Well, actually, it would be three. One is find that thing you're passionate about. I mean, you have to have some passion for something. Like Howard Rourke in the Fountainhead. I mean, he was passionate about his architecture. I think you have to find something that really drives you. Secondly is learn how to think. I mean, obviously, we've had this conversation, is you really have to be able to think and think critically and to engage others in critical thought, because that's really important to moving the ball forward. I mean, anybody can repeat what they've already heard, but if you want to have an impact, you have to be able to look at things with a real critical eye. And the one thing that I've told everybody, and in fact, I had a conversation this morning with one of our interns, to me the most important skill is to be able to write. I think that's a lost art today, and I even look at it, with my own kids. The fact that we have these computer systems, makes it very easy to get words into a document, but I don't think it makes it easy to help organize ideas and to explain things and articulate things clearly and effectively. So I encourage everybody that works with me to learn to write, to take a writing course so that you can learn to express yourself effectively. You can have the greatest ideas in the world, but if you can't convey those ideas effectively to other people, usually in writing, then they're meaningless. They have no value. So those are my recommendations. But absolutely, take a writing class. Learn how to communicate. That's really important.
That's awesome. I hope everyone enjoyed this. I know I did. I look forward to having Paul back on for a follow-up podcast. If you guys have any comments about what you would like to hear Paul talk about a little bit more, you could either comment on the YouTube channel or on our blog. This will be up hopefully in the next 2 weeks. It's depending upon everyone's review on this. Again, Paul, thank you so much. For me, it's great to hear your voice again and to have these conversations that I so missed.
It's been my pleasure, Marcelo, and I look forward to the next one.